afraid of the voters in some capacity. So to give some context for this, they did doubt voters' abilities to make choices, and part of this is based on the social conditions. So there was a general lack of education and literacy. There was a lack of access to information, so there wasn't mass media the way that we think of it today. Traveling was very, very difficult. Journalism was of questionable quality. So it was hard to get information, literally, because you couldn't travel. And the information that you could get, you might not be able to read and might just be completely shoddy in the first place. But given that they were afraid of the masses, and they had very real reasons to be, there was overwhelming evidence of support for an election by the people. So what does that mean? They still wanted input from the public. They didn't want to completely rule out the public's wishes. They were just a little bit afraid of what the public sort of looked like and their ability to make any reasoned choice. So this created what they believed as the necessity for intermediaries. So they thought that they could create this body of electors that would exercise discretion, that would be extraordinary citizens and civil servants. I have to say, reading this, you're like, what were they thinking? So naive. We were these great citizens. But they did believe that the electors would serve as a buffer between the president and the masses. And one limitation of their discussion of the electors is that they don't really present a clear role for the popular will. They didn't really think this out theoretically. We want the popular will matters and what the public wants matters, but they don't actually convey how they thought the Electoral College would embody this. So the Electoral College is an intermediary, but how does it actually capture the public will or representation? They also wanted to limit presidential power. So this fits into that fear of the tyranny of the king. So they were against the concentrated power in electing the president. And the EC, the Electoral College, was a body of persons. So what does that mean? They feared other institutional arrangements. You know, what if we had a group of 4 people that elect the president, that they could have so much power and they could concentrate so much power in government that it would be incredibly problematic. Whereas the Electoral College is a relatively large institution with a diverse group of members with diverse backgrounds. They come from states all across the union. They're not federal officials. So they thought that this wouldn't concentrate power the same way as some other institutional arrangements would. But they also feared direct election, and that this would consolidate power in the president that was similar to a king. So if we think about the divine mandate, which justified king's power, so God chose me as the king, therefore I have the right to do whatever I want because it's God's will. You could think of this similarly to the popular will. The public chose me, therefore I can do what I want because I am the representation of the public's will. So they were very afraid of this, the president becoming king-like based on the wants of the public. And you also have to realize that they didn't have experience in designing a system like this. This was really the first system like this in the world, so they didn't know what to expect. So these fears were very legitimate.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
How did they get to that conclusion if they set up a House and a Senate and a Supreme Court that the president could be king-like?
Well, I think it was just given the context. So they didn't know how the institution would play out in the real world, and given their fear of the king, I think that I'm not sure that that was a rational thought, but I think it was based on the experiences that they had. They just thought that there was the chance that the president could become all-powerful. And we do see in American government that the presidency is a very powerful institution. So I don't know, I think part of it was the fear of the unknown, or the inability to predict what the future would look like. So they also faced demographic problems with population differences among states. So the states were very varied regarding population. Some were much smaller than others. They feared that large states would overwhelm small states. This was a concern throughout the Constitutional Convention. They faced the burden of consolidating competing states and regions into a cohesive nation. And we can think about the Articles of Confederation and what happens when we have a completely ineffective federal government, these states competing for power. And the Electoral College was really the result of a compromise between large and small states, much like our other institutions for representation. So slavery also factored into the framers' intentions. The divide wasn't just between large and small states, but it was also between slave and non-slave states. So Southerners feared that a direct vote would shift the balance of power to the North because slaves couldn't vote. So, and also the North had a larger population, they had a much larger non-slave population, and they also had wider suffrage rights. So in the South, very few people could vote. They feared that this would make their representation less. So the Electoral College protected slave owners because the Electoral College votes were partially based on the slave population, so the 3/5 compromise. So what were their short-term goals? Well, first we talked a little bit about the context. The convention was beset with tensions and rivalries between small and large states, North and South, slave and non-slave. There also was a very strong contention between federal rights versus state rights and the role of the federal government versus the role of state governments. And they also thought about what the institutions should look like. So should we have a triumvirate or a single president? What should these things look like? Also, it was Philadelphia in the middle of summer, so it was brutally hot. I'm sure that made them a little bit more miserable. So the Electoral College was created out of the pressure to avoid this conflict. It was a practical consideration. It was not the result of apparent design. They didn't go in and say, we have the perfect idea for how to elect our president. It was really the result of throwing ideas around and seeing what everyone could live with. It was the result of compromises and conflicts. It was the first choice of few delegates, and it's seen as the least bad option. So when I say least bad, what do I mean? I mean the other two options being direct election and election by Congress. So, and most delegates thought that the problems with the Electoral College would not be immediate, so they figured we'll get this taken care of during the convention, and then we'll deal with it when it blows up in a few years. But that really didn't happen too well, so we're here today. So, and they also knew that George Washington was going to win, so they didn't have to worry about it. They had, 8 years to figure this problem out, let it play out. So what are the relevance of these conditions? So the relevance of the social and political conditions. The threat of a king or a dictator really is unthinkable. We don't think that if we change the Electoral College, the United States is going to collapse into non-democracy. No, that threat really is not pressing on us. And the threat of this mob rule is unthinkable as well, because in terms of elections, we have very well-developed election administrations. We have a well-developed police force, National Guard, military. We have the institutions to address mobs and riots. We also have automated voting. Machines are becoming more and more popular. We can recount the vote. It's easy to communicate with other states. There's national media. And I think as a general sentiment, many voters feel that their presidential vote might not matter. So their concern was that we had too much democracy, right? That the democratic sentiments had gone unruly. Whereas we kind of feel like we need more democracy. So I'll give my example from coming from Maryland. Maryland is a one-party state. It's very democratic. I think we have the longest running streak of democratic governors like in the history of the United States or something like that. So I can say it's very common to hear Republicans in Maryland say, I feel like my vote doesn't matter, right? Why vote? Why vote in elections? Because it just doesn't even count, because I know that the Electoral College votes are going to the Democratic candidate. And also we can think about very low voter turnout, low political participation. So this idea that maybe we need more democracy and an institution that encourages more democracy. Some of the other conditions that Americans are very literate. We have access to information through the internet, television, radio, newspapers. This idea of defending slavery is unthinkable. The thought that this was part of the creation of the Electoral College is very problematic. This legislative election, it's not an option on the table. We'll talk about the options for changing the Electoral College later. No one is saying you should go to a system where Congress chooses the president. And the powers granted to the president wouldn't change if we changed the Electoral College. So we could change the body that elects the president without actually changing the institution of the president. So the political and social factors, they do seem a little bit outdated, but the concerns about institutional design are very relevant. So although we couldn't justify a lot of their social decisions, some of the aspects that they were concerned about really can help guide us throughout the rest of this forum today and throughout the rest of the forums that we will present. So their relevant concerns were about institutional design and complexity. So what is the institution going to look like? How is it going to operate? Who are going to be the members? What are their roles going to be? The nature of representation in democracy. How do we translate the popular will into an institution that can capture it? How do we run a democracy. It's about basic aspects of democratic governments. And what are the role of states? We still see this tension between the powers of the federal government and the power of state governments. And I think just to sort of put it in context for the rest of the presentation, what we're doing now, trying to figure out how to change the Electoral College, is not that different from what they did then. So we talk about what are the political conditions we face, what are our institutional constraints. Let's try to guess about what the outcome would look like. So we should use that to think about how we're in a very similar position to potentially change how electing the president looks.